The story of Meyer Lansky is not merely a chronicle of a criminal's life. It is a deep, intricate study of the very architecture of power, a blueprint of how to build an empire, not with fists, but with fractions, not with terror, but with ledgers. To truly understand the man who would become the mob's accountant, one must first journey back to the genesis, to the crucible that forged his steel, trapped mind, and his unshakable belief in the supremacy of intellect over brute force. His world began not in the glittering casinos of Havana or the smoky backrooms of New York, but in the cramped, cobblestone streets of Grodno, a city then part of the vast and turbulent Russian Empire. He was born Meyer Lansky on a day that would, in his future homeland, be celebrated with fireworks and fanfare as the ultimate symbol of freedom, the 4th of July in the year 1902. But his childhood was devoid of any such celebration. His earliest memories were not of playgrounds and childish games, but of the pervasive, suffocating fear that defined Jewish life within the confines of the Pale of Settlement. It was a world perpetually balanced on the knife's edge of a pogrom, where the air was thick with the anticipation of violence, where the sound of booted feet on cobblestones could signal the end of everything. This was his first and most formative lesson in the brutal realities of existence, the understanding that the world was fundamentally divided into two categories: those who wielded power and those who suffered it. He learned that without power, you were simply a potential victim, waiting for the hammer to fall. This foundational trauma, this intimate acquaintance with vulnerability, did not make him bitter. Instead, it made him preternaturally calculating. It instilled in him a cold, clear-eyed determination to never again be on the receiving end of that hammer. He would, by any means necessary, become the one who held the handle. In 1911, when Meyer was just 9 years old, his family made the arduous decision to escape this cycle of fear, joining the great wave of Jewish immigration to the United States. They arrived at Ellis Island. Their name anglicized to Lansky, their spirits filled with the promise of the Golden Land. They settled on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a teeming, vibrant, and brutally overcrowded melting pot of immigrants, all struggling for a foothold in the new world. The streets were just as tough as those in Grodno, but here, the oppression was less about state-sanctioned murder and more about the daily, grinding struggle for survival, for respect, for a piece of the American dream. It was in this chaotic, competitive environment that the young Meyer Lansky began his real education. He was a small, slight boy, physically unimpressive, which made him an immediate target for the larger, tougher boys who ruled the streets. But Lansky possessed a weapon far more potent than any muscle, a formidable, lightning, fast intellect, and a quiet, observant nature. He quickly realized that direct confrontation was a fool's game. Instead, he learned to operate from the shadows, to use strategy and alliances as his primary tools. It was on these very streets that he would meet the two individuals who would shape the course of his life, and, by extension, the history of American organized crime. The first was a hot-headed, fiercely ambitious young Sicilian named Salvatore Lucania, who would later become famous to the world as Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano was everything Lansky was not: physically imposing, charismatic in a rough, street-level way, and possessed of a bold, almost reckless ambition. The second was another Jewish boy, a rugged and fearless brawler from Brooklyn named Benjamin Siegel, who the world would later know and fear as Bugsy. This trio, the brain, the ambition, and the ferocity, formed a symbiotic partnership that would prove unstoppable. Lansky, even as a teenager, was the undisputed strategist. While Luciano dreamed of being the boss and Siegel dreamed of being the most feared enforcer, Lansky dreamed of building a system. He saw the chaotic, disorganized street gangs of the era as inefficient and vulnerable. He began to apply his mathematical mind to the business of crime, understanding that it was, at its core, just another form of commerce. He organized their petty thefts and protection rackets with the precision of a corporate manager, calculating risks, profits, and losses. He was the one who insisted on reinvesting their earnings into more sophisticated, less risky ventures. It was during these formative years that he developed his lifelong mantra, a principle that would guide every one of his future endeavors. You can get further with a kind word and a gun than you can with just a kind word, he would often say, but he always placed the emphasis on the first part. The gun was the final argument, but the real work was done with the kind word, the shrewd deal, the unshakable logic of a profitable partnership. He understood that lasting power wasn't derived from fear alone. It was built on a foundation of mutual benefit and unbreakable trust within his own circle. This code of honor, this insistence on loyalty and discretion, became his trademark. While other gangsters boasted and brawled in public, Lansky remained in the background, a quiet, neatly dressed young man who spoke in a soft, measured tone and whose eyes missed nothing. He was building his empire, one carefully calculated relationship, one perfectly executed plan at a time, all while the world around him was on the brink of a seismic shift that would provide him with the opportunity of a lifetime. The coming of Prohibition, the ratification of the 18th Amendment in 1920, which ushered in the era of Prohibition, did not create Meyer Lansky. It simply provided the perfect canvas upon which his genius could paint a masterpiece of illicit enterprise, while moralists celebrated the dawn of a sober America, and while ordinary citizens grumbled about the loss of their legal libations, Lansky saw something else entirely, a vacuum. He perceived a fundamental economic truth, that the American desire for alcohol was an inelastic demand, a thirst that no law could ever quench. This was not a moral problem to him, it was a logistical one. The entire nation had suddenly become a dry county, and he, along with his partners Luciano and Siegel, were positioned to become its most prolific and efficient distributors. This was the moment the street gang evolved into a sophisticated corporation, and Lansky was its chief executive officer. His first act was to apply his meticulous mind to the supply chain. He understood that controlling the source was everything. While smaller, disorganized bootleggers relied on haphazardly produced bathtub gin and moonshine, Lansky insisted on quality. He established connections with master distillers in Canada, Scotland, and Ireland. He forged alliances with rum runners in the Caribbean, creating a complex international network of ships and speedboats that could outrun the fledgling Coast Guard. He saw the entire eastern seaboard not as a collection of separate cities, but as a single, integrated market. His operation was a marvel of efficiency. A ship from Scotland would anchor in international waters known as Rum Row. From there, a fleet of fast, agile contact boats, often funded by Lansky and commanded by the fearless Bugsy Siegel, would ferry the cargo to hidden coves and secluded beaches along the Jersey Shore and Long Island. From there, a convoy of trucks, their drivers paid handsomely for their silence and their skill, would distribute the precious liquid to a network of speakeasies, nightclubs, and private clients that spanned from Boston to Philadelphia. But Lansky's brilliance truly shone in the financial structuring of this empire. He created a system of layered shell companies and front businesses. A trucking company that legitimately hauled furniture by day would be moving cases of scotch by night. A laundry service was a perfect way to legitimize large cash flows. He developed sophisticated money moving techniques, using a network of complicit bankers and brokers to wash the profits, making the dirty money clean. He kept multiple sets of books, all in his head or in a coded shorthand that only he could fully decipher. This was where he earned his nickname, the mob's accountant. But that title was a profound understatement. He was not merely keeping track of the money. He was architecting a financial system parallel to the legitimate economy. He understood the power of liquidity and investment long before Wall Street coined the term. The profits from alcohol were not squandered on flashy cars and gaudy jewelry. They were reinvested. A portion was set aside as a bank for the organization. A fund used to bail out arrested members, pay for the best legal defense, and provide for the families of those who were killed or imprisoned. This created an unbreakable loyalty. Another portion was invested in expanding their portfolio. They moved into union racketeering, realizing that controlling the Teamsters or the Longshoremen's Union meant you controlled the flow of goods for entire cities. They muscled into the garment industry, the food markets. Anywhere there was a flow of cash and a vulnerability to be exploited. Yet, throughout this explosive growth, Lansky maintained his low profile, while Al Capone in Chicago became a notorious public figure. A celebrity gangster whose name was splashed across every newspaper, Lansky operated in the shadows. He dressed conservatively, lived modestly, and spoke softly. He was a ghost, a rumor. This was a deliberate and calculated strategy. He knew that notoriety was a liability, that the spotlight brought the heat of the police and the taxman. His power was not derived from his public reputation, but from the silent, unquestioned authority he wielded in private meetings. He was the mediator in disputes, the arbiter of gangland justice, the man whose word was final, because it was always backed by cold, hard logic and the unspoken threat of Siegel's terrifying efficiency. This period also saw the forging of his most crucial alliance, the National Crime Syndicate, often simply called the Commission. It was Lansky, the intellectual, and Luciano, the visionary, who conceived of this idea, a board of directors for the American underworld. They brought together the powerful, warring crime families of New York, the Italians, the Jews, the Irish, and convinced them that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. They drew up treaties, delineated territories, and established protocols for resolving disputes without all-out war. Lansky was the indispensable man in these negotiations, the trusted intermediary who could speak to all sides, whose mathematical fairness and dispassionate demeanor made him the only one capable of building such a fragile peace. He was the glue that held this volatile coalition together, because everyone knew that Meyer Lansky's primary, his only true loyalty was to the bottom line. By the end of the 1920s, the boy from Grodno was one of the most powerful men in America, though few outside a small, secretive circle would ever know his name. He had built a machine that printed money, a shadow government that operated with more efficiency than many legitimate corporations. But the end of prohibition was on the horizon, a threat that would have crippled a lesser criminal mind. For Meyer Lansky, it was merely a pivot, a challenge that would force him to engineer his next and even more audacious master plan. The repeal of prohibition in 1933 was a cataclysmic event for the American underworld, an earthquake that shattered the financial foundations of countless criminal enterprises that had grown fat and complacent on the easy money of bootlegging. For many, it was the end of the line, a forced retirement into obscurity, or a desperate, bloody scramble for the scraps of other, less lucrative rackets. But for Meyer Lansky, the end of the noble experiment was not an end at all. It was a strategic inflection point, a necessary evolution. He had anticipated this day for years, understanding that the political winds were shifting, and he had prepared his empire accordingly. The vast capital he had accumulated was not sitting idle. It was a war chest ready to be deployed into the next great frontier of legalized vice. While others panicked, Lansky saw a map of the United States not as a collection of dry states and wet states, but as a chessboard, and he was about to make his most brilliant move. His gaze settled on a dusty, sparsely populated patch of desert in Nevada, a place then known for little more than its railroad siding and its liberal divorce laws, Las Vegas. The idea was audacious, almost ludicrous. To build a glittering oasis of gambling and entertainment in the middle of nowhere seemed like a fantasy, the kind of wild scheme only a dreamer like his old friend Bugsy Siegel would fully embrace. But Lansky, the pragmatist, ran the numbers. He saw the potential for a perfectly controlled environment, a city built from the ground up to separate tourists from their money in a way that was, on the surface, completely legal. Nevada had legalized gambling in 1931, and Lansky understood that this legal framework was not an obstacle, but a shield. It provided a veneer of legitimacy behind which the syndicate could operate with unprecedented freedom. He was the silent, primary investor in Siegel's Flamingo Hotel, the project that would become the prototype for the modern Las Vegas Strip. He funneled millions of syndicate dollars into the construction. But he grew increasingly frustrated with Siegel's grandiose vision and mismanagement. The Flamingo was bleeding money, its costs spiraling out of control due to Siegel's obsession with perfection and his notorious temper. Lansky, the ultimate rationalist, saw this not as a passion project, but as a failing investment. The Flamingo's disastrous initial opening in 1946 was the final straw. It confirmed Lansky's fears that Siegel's emotional attachment to the project was jeopardizing the entire syndicate's financial future. The decision that followed was one of the most coldly calculated in the history of organized crime. The Commission, with Lansky's tacit approval, issued a death sentence on their old friend. The murder of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel in his girlfriend's Beverly Hills home in 1947 was a stark, brutal message to the entire underworld. Sentimentality has no place in business. It was the ultimate enforcement of the corporate model Lansky had always championed. With Siegel gone, Lansky and his associates took firm, quiet control of the Flamingo and the burgeoning Las Vegas scene. They installed their own managers, their own accountants, their own men on the casino floors. This was where Lansky's genius for systems reached its zenith. He designed the infamous skim, a sophisticated, nearly undetectable method of siphoning untaxed cash directly from the casino counting rooms before the official profits were ever calculated for the state gaming authorities. This was pure, untraceable revenue flowing directly back to the crime families in New York, Cleveland, and Chicago, funding their operations and enriching their leaders. The casinos themselves became massive money laundering machines where the illicit profits from narcotics, union corruption, and extortion could be funneled through the slot machines and gaming tables, emerging on the other side as legitimate casino winnings. Lansky's vision transformed Las Vegas from a dusty outpost into the syndicate's single greatest financial engine. But his ambitions were not confined to the American desert. He looked south to an island paradise that was already a playground for the rich and famous Cuba. Under the corrupt dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, Cuba was a wide, open territory, and Lansky saw it as a potential Las Vegas on steroids, a tropical haven where American tourists could indulge in every vice imaginable. He had old contacts there from the running days, and he quickly forged a direct, lucrative partnership with Batista himself. Lansky became the de facto minister of gambling for Cuba. He oversaw the renovation and management of the Hotel National in Havana, turning it into a world-class casino resort. He designed the Riviera, a stunning, modern hotel that he built from the ground up, personally overseeing every detail to ensure maximum profitability and operational security. He instituted his Las Vegas systems, the skim and the control, on an even grander scale. For a time, Cuba was a golden goose, a river of cash that flowed directly into the coffers of the syndicate and into the Swiss bank accounts of Batista and his cronies. Lansky was at the absolute peak of his power, a kingmaker who controlled the flow of fortune in two separate countries. He was no longer just a mob accountant. He was an international financier, a shadow developer, a man who dealt directly with presidents and dictators as an equal. He had achieved the impossible dream of every gangster, immense wealth and power, all wrapped in a cloak of apparent legitimacy. He had homes in Miami Beach. He was a respected figure in certain Jewish philanthropic circles, and he moved through the world not as a hunted criminal, but as a successful, if somewhat mysterious, businessman. The lessons of his childhood seemed to have been thoroughly conquered. He was no longer the vulnerable boy from Grodno. He was the man who held the hammer, the architect of a global empire built on his own intellect and will. But empires, no matter how well constructed, are never permanent. The very success of his operations in Las Vegas and Havana had placed him squarely in the crosshairs of a new, relentless, and technologically sophisticated enemy who was not interested in bribes or intimidated by violence. The federal government of the United States was finally beginning to understand the scale of the conspiracy he had built, and they were assembling a team of men who were, in their own way, as smart and as determined as Meyer Lansky himself. The downfall of Meyer Lansky's empire did not arrive with the dramatic thunder of a police raid or the bark of a judge's gavel, but with the quiet, methodical turning of pages and the soft click of a tape recorder. For decades, he had operated in the shadows, believing that his low profile, his intricate corporate veils, and his mastery of financial obfuscation made him untouchable. He had outsmarted local police, corrupted city officials, and even navigated the complex politics of the underworld with flawless precision. But the post-war era saw the rise of a new kind of adversary, one that was patient, well-funded, and armed with a powerful new weapon, the relentless, bureaucratic might of the federal government. Specifically, the Federal Bureau of Investigation under the single-minded obsession of its director, J. Edgar Hoover. For years, Hoover had notoriously denied the very existence of a National Crime Syndicate, focusing the Bureau's resources on chasing bank robbers and communist spies. But mounting political pressure and sensationalized Senate hearings finally forced his hand. The name Meyer Lansky began to appear with increasing frequency in intelligence reports, not as a peripheral figure, but as a central node in a vast, interconnected network. The FBI's campaign against Lansky was a war of attrition, a slow, grinding process of legal and psychological pressure designed to dismantle his life piece by piece. It began with surveillance. Agents set up watch on his modest apartment in New York and later his home in Miami Beach. They noted every visitor, every license plate, every trash can collection. They installed hidden microphones in his favorite restaurants and clubs, hoping to catch a snippet of an incriminating conversation. But Lansky, a man who had lived his entire life assuming he was being watched, was a ghost. He spoke in code, conducted his most sensitive business on payphones, and never, ever put anything in writing. The wiretaps yielded hours of mundane conversation about family, health, and the weather, but nothing the prosecutors could use. The next front was financial. The Internal Revenue Service was unleashed upon him. Tasked with the monumental job of untangling the global web of shell corporations, hidden accounts, and nominee owners he had spent a lifetime weaving. This was perhaps the greatest challenge, as Lansky's financial architecture was a masterpiece of deception. Money would flow from a casino in Havana to a holding company in Panama, then to a bank in Switzerland, only to be reinvested in a seemingly legitimate real estate venture in Miami. Following the trail was like trying to track a single drop of water through the ocean. Yet, the IRS agents were dogged. They painstakingly reconstructed his life, analyzing his spending habits against his declared income. How could a man who claimed to have no significant source of wealth afford a comfortable home, support his family, and travel frequently? It was a slow, tedious process, but it began to build a picture of a man living a lie. The pressure started to take a toll in more personal ways. The constant surveillance was a form of psychological torture. Lansky could never be sure if the man reading a newspaper across the street was an agent, if his phone was clean, if a new business associate was wearing a wire. The world he had so carefully constructed began to feel like a gilded cage. This sense of encroaching doom was exacerbated by the changing political landscape, which delivered a catastrophic blow to his operations. The Cuban Revolution of 1959, led by Fidel Castro, was a disaster of epic proportions for the syndicate. In one fell swoop, Castro's rebels marched into Havana and shut down every casino and brothel that Lansky and his associates had built. They nationalized the properties, expelled the American mobsters, and cut off the multi-million-dollar river of cash that had been flowing from the island. Lansky reportedly lost an estimated $7,000 million in personal investments overnight, a staggering sum at the time. More importantly, it severed one of the two main arteries of his empire. He was now reliant almost entirely on Las Vegas, which was itself coming under increased scrutiny from the FBI and the newly formed Nevada Gaming Control Board. The noose was tightening. The first significant legal blow fell not on Lansky himself, but on his closest allies, a strategy designed to isolate him and turn them into witnesses against him. The government began to score victories using its new tools, like the Travel Act, which made it a federal crime to use interstate commerce to further illegal activity, and the powerful racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations act, the Reichso statute, which allowed prosecutors to target the entire structure of a criminal enterprise as a single entity. One by one, his old partners were indicted, convicted, or deported. The code of silence. The omerta that had protected them for so long began to crack under the pressure of lengthy prison sentences. Men who had once been loyal started to calculate their own odds of survival, and the name they all whispered to the prosecutors was Meyer Lansky. He was no longer the invisible architect. He was now public enemy number one in the eyes of the federal government. The boy who had fled the pogroms of Russia was now being hunted by the most powerful nation on earth. The man who had believed that intellect could always outmaneuver brute force was about to learn that the brute force of the state, when applied with persistence and the full weight of the law, was an opponent against which there was no ultimate defense. The final act of his life was to become a protracted, draining battle against extradition, against tax charges, against the relentless pursuit of a system that would not rest until it had claimed his freedom, if not his entire fortune. The ghost was being dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light. The final decades of Meyer Lansky's life were a masterclass in defensive maneuvering, a slow, strategic retreat fought in courtrooms and through legal filings rather than in the back alleys of his youth. He became a ghost fighting a war against a visible, relentless army, using every tool of delay, procedure, and legal technicality he could muster. The first major legal assault came in 1970, when a federal grand jury in New York indicted him for conspiracy in what was touted as the largest tax evasion case in history. The government alleged he had hidden over $1 million in income, a figure that was undoubtedly a mere fraction of his true wealth, but was symbolic of their intent to finally bring him to heel. For Lansky, this was the battle he had spent his entire life preparing for, and his defense was a testament to his meticulous nature. He assembled a team of brilliant, high-priced attorneys who attacked the case not on its emotional merits, but on the cold, hard facts of evidence and procedure. The trial was a monumental affair, with the prosecution presenting a complex web of financial transactions, attempting to trace funds from hidden Swiss accounts back to his control. But Lansky's lifetime of secrecy served as his ultimate shield. The paper trail was intentionally fragmented, spread across multiple countries with strict banking secrecy laws. Key witnesses were either unwilling to testify or their credibility was easily shredded by the defense, who painted them as desperate criminals seeking leniency by fabricating stories about a reclusive old man. The prosecution's case, while ambitious, was built on circumstantial evidence and inference, and it struggled to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Meyer Lansky, the quiet grandfather from Miami Beach, was the same person as the legendary financial mastermind of the underworld. After a protracted trial, the jury found themselves deadlocked, resulting in a mistrial. The government, stunned and resource drained, was forced to drop the charges. It was seen as Lansky's greatest courtroom victory, a stunning defeat for the Justice Department, and a reaffirmation of his belief that he was smarter than the system. But the war was far from over. The victory was Pyrrhic, costing him a fortune in legal fees and, more importantly, further cementing his status as the ultimate prize for federal prosecutors. The relentless pressure continued from other angles. The Nevada Gaming Control Board, now armed with more power and determination, made it their mission to purge his influence, and indeed the influence of any organized crime, from Las Vegas. While they couldn't convict him of a crime, they used their regulatory power to effectively blacklist him and his associates. Anyone with even a rumored connection to Lansky was denied a gaming license, forced to sell their interests or run out of town. The sophisticated skim he had designed was systematically dismantled as corporate conglomerates with clean, publicly traded money began to buy up the old mob-owned casinos. The The city he had helped build was sanitizing itself, pushing out the very men who had founded it. His world was shrinking, his power base eroding. Then came what was perhaps the most personally devastating legal battle, an attempt by the U.S. government to deport him. Having never become a naturalized American citizen, he was still technically an alien, and the government sought to revoke his resident status and send him back to his country of origin. The thought of being deported, of being stripped of his American identity and cast out from the country he had helped shape in its shadowy underbelly, was a profound humiliation. He fought the deportation with every resource he had, a fight that dragged on for years through a labyrinth of immigration courts. His health began to fail during this period. He suffered from a bad heart and the immense stress of perpetual legal warfare. The once sharp mind was now burdened with the fatigue of a lifetime spent looking over his shoulder. In a desperate and ironic move, he even applied for Israeli citizenship under the law of return, which grants any Jew the right to settle in Israel. For a brief moment, it seemed he might find a final refuge in the Jewish homeland. A bitter twist for a man who had built his empire on activities that were illegal in the very state he now sought sanctuary in. But the Israeli government, under intense pressure from the United States and wary of importing such a notorious figure, ultimately denied his application. The Supreme Court of Israel upheld the decision, stating that Lansky was not a Jew who lived a life consistent with the values of the state. He was trapped, a man without a country, besieged in his own adopted home. The final years were a portrait of a king in exile, but an exile within his own borders. He lived a quiet, paranoid, and increasingly isolated life in a small, nondescript apartment in Miami Beach. The great fortune he was rumored to have controlled, the hundreds of millions stashed in secret Swiss vaults, seemed to have vanished into the ether. Whether it was lost to legal fees seized by governments, or so well hidden that even his own family could not access it, remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of organized crime. The man who had controlled the flow of money for an entire underworld died with a modest, almost pitiful, estate. On January 15, 1983, Meyer Lansky died of lung cancer at the age of 80 in a Miami hospital. There was no dramatic deathbed confession, no revelation of hidden treasures. He took the full, unvarnished truth of his life, his empire, and his fortune with him to the grave. His death was not the end of his story, but the final, masterful act of obfuscation in a life defined by it. He had outlived most of his contemporaries. He had beaten the most serious criminal charges, and he had denied the world the satisfaction of a definitive conclusion. In death, as in life, Meyer Lansky remained an enigma, a ghost in the machine he himself had built, the ultimate testament to a mind that believed it could calculate its way around any obstacle, even mortality itself. The legacy of Meyer Lansky is a phantom that continues to haunt the corridors of power, finance, and law enforcement, a ghostly blueprint of how to construct and conceal an empire of illicit wealth. His death did not bring closure. Instead, it unleashed a torrent of speculation, myth, and forensic accounting that persists to this day, a final testament to the sheer brilliance of his obscurity. The most tantalizing and enduring mystery is, of course, the question of the missing fortune. For decades, intelligence agencies, journalists, and former associates have hunted for the hundreds of millions of dollars he was believed to have accumulated, a treasure rumored to be hidden in secret Swiss bank accounts, Panamanian shell corporations, or investments in legitimate businesses across the globe. The official records told a story of a man who died with little more than a few $100,000 to his name, a narrative so incongruous with his known influence that it could only be interpreted as his final and perhaps greatest deception. The search for Lansky's money became an obsession for many, a real life treasure hunt that spanned continents. Some believed he had secretly purchased vast holdings in the nascent technology industry or in international real estate through a web of untraceable intermediaries. Others theorized that the money was never liquid wealth at all, but had been converted into diamonds, gold, or priceless art stored in safety deposit boxes under false names in Zurich or Geneva. The most compelling theories suggest that the fortune was never lost, but was seamlessly integrated into the legitimate global financial system. Its criminal origins laundered so thoroughly that it became indistinguishable from clean capital, a dormant asset waiting for a signal to be activated by his heirs, a signal that never came. This financial enigma has had a profound and tangible impact on the world, far beyond the realm of gangster lore. The United States government's protracted and often frustrating battle to pin down Lansky's assets directly catalyzed a revolution in financial crime legislation and enforcement, the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970, which required financial institutions to report large cash transactions and keep records of their customers' identities, was a direct response to the methods perfected by men like Lansky. The creation of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, within the Treasury Department was another institutional legacy of this pursuit, an entire agency dedicated to doing what once seemed impossible, tracking the kind of complex international money flows that Lansky had pioneered. His life story became a permanent case study at the FBI Academy in Quantico and in university criminology departments, a masterclass in the vulnerabilities of a financial system that could be exploited by a determined and intelligent adversary. He forced the system to become smarter, more connected, and more intrusive, leading to the sophisticated anti-money laundering protocols that are now a standard part of global finance. In a bitter irony, the very secrecy havens he helped popularize, like Switzerland, have come under immense international pressure to reform their banking laws, largely due to the specter of figures like Lansky, who demonstrated how easily they could be used to hide illicit wealth. His influence even extends into popular culture, though in a form he would have undoubtedly despised. While his more flamboyant partners, like Lucky Luciano and Bugsy Siegel, were immortalized in film by charismatic movie stars, Lansky's portrayals have been quieter, more cerebral, often as a background schemer whispering in the ear of the more volatile boss. This public perception, or lack thereof, was exactly what he had cultivated, yet it fails to capture the true scale of his innovation. He was not a side character, he was the director and the producer. The modern understanding of organized crime as a business, a Cosa Nostra, or our thing, is fundamentally his creation. He took the tribal, neighborhood-based gangs of the early 20th century and merged them into a multinational, vertically integrated conglomerate with a diversified portfolio. The corporate structure of the modern American Mafia, with its clear divisions between leadership, operations, and enforcement, bears the unmistakable imprint of his logical, dispassionate mind. He was the one who proved that crime could, and should, be run like a Fortune 500 company, with long-term strategic planning, risk management, and profit-sharing schemes. This corporatization of violence and vice was his most damaging and enduring contribution to the American underworld, a model that was later adopted and refined by drug cartels, Russian oligarchs, and cybercriminals. The digital age, with its cryptocurrencies and dark web marketplaces, is merely the latest iteration of the same fundamental problem Lansky identified and exploited: the lag between technological innovation and regulatory oversight. He would have undoubtedly been a master of blockchain and offshore digital banking, seeing in them the same opportunities for anonymity and obfuscation that he once found in numbered Swiss accounts and Panamanian front companies. His story is therefore not a relic of a bygone era, but a chillingly relevant cautionary tale about the perpetual cat and mouse game between crime and the state. The boy who fled the pogroms of Grodno ultimately became a different kind of revolutionary, one who did not seek to overthrow governments with bullets, but to hollow them out from within, using the most corrosive weapon of all: untraceable, unaccountable, and limitless capital. He demonstrated that the most dangerous criminal is not the one who rules through fear, but the one who engineers a system where the crime itself becomes invisible, leaving behind only the ghost of the money and the legend of the man who made it disappear. To truly comprehend the labyrinthine genius of Meyer Lansky, one must venture beyond the broad strokes of his empire and descend into the granular details of his operational methodology, a shadowy realm where his true legacy was forged. His was not a world of dramatic heists or public confrontations. It was a world of whispered percentages, of perfectly balanced ledgers, and of psychological manipulations so subtle they were often felt rather than seen. The core of his philosophy, the unshakable principle that guided every decision, was the concept of deniable plausibility. Every action, every financial transaction, every relationship was structured with multiple layers of insulation, designed to collapse under legal scrutiny before the core truth could ever be exposed. He understood that the law required proof, not just suspicion, and he became a master at manufacturing doubt and distance. His communication system was a work of art in itself. He rarely used the telephone for sensitive matters, preferring face-to-face conversations in moving vehicles, on parked benches, or amidst the noise of a crowded public place. When he was forced to use a phone, He spoke in a language of metaphors and allusions that was impenetrable to outsiders. A discussion about a problematic associate might be framed as a critique of a poorly performing employee in a fictional business. A multi-million-dollar wire transfer would be referred to as shipping a consignment of furniture. He trained his inner circle in this linguistic code, creating a barrier that even the most sophisticated wiretap could not breach. His management of the syndicate's finances was equally Byzantine. He did not merely hide money. He orchestrated its perpetual motion. A cash skim from the Flamingo in Las Vegas would not sit in a safe. It would be immediately broken down into smaller amounts, given to a series of couriers, often unsuspecting individuals who believed they were simply carrying business documents, and transported across state lines to a series of counting houses in cities like Miami, New York, and Chicago. From there, the money would be aggregated again and handed off to a financial specialist who would then use it to purchase cashier's checks or bonds, or to funnel it into one of the many shell corporations he controlled. These corporations, with innocuous names like Southern Import, Export, or Preliminary Manufacturing, Inc., were legal entities on paper, with appointed presidents and boards of directors who were often lawyers or front men with no criminal records. These companies would then engage in legitimate, looking transactions with each other, inflating invoices for services never rendered or goods never delivered, effectively washing the money through a complex cycle of debits and credits until its original, criminal source was virtually untraceable. This system required an army of complicit professionals, accountants, bankers, lawyers, who were paid exorbitant retainers for their silence and their specialized knowledge. Lansky cultivated these relationships with care, appealing not to their criminal instincts, but to their greed and their professional arrogance, making them feel like partners in a sophisticated financial enterprise rather than accessories to a crime. His understanding of human psychology was perhaps his greatest weapon. He knew how to leverage every individual's unique vulnerability. For some, it was pure financial incentive. For others, it was the allure of power, the thrill of being connected to someone of his whispered reputation. For the few who possessed a moral compass, he had a more insidious approach. He would frame his requests as a necessity for the protection, for the advancement of the Jewish people, portraying himself as a modern day Robin Hood who used his ill-gotten gains to support Jewish charities, fund the defense of Israel, and protect his community from the anti-Semitic threats that still lingered in American society. This moral flexibility allowed him to recruit individuals who would have otherwise never consorted with a common gangster. He was a master of reading a room, of understanding the unspoken dynamics of power. In meetings of the commission, while the Italian dons postured and argued, Lansky would often remain silent, observing. He would let the emotional currents flow until they had exhausted themselves, and then, in his soft, calm voice, he would present a solution that was so logically sound, so clearly in everyone's best financial interest, that it was impossible to refute. He never raised his voice never made overt threats. The threat was always implicit, carried not by his words, but by the presence of his enforcers like Siegel, and by the universal understanding that crossing Meyer Lansky meant being cut off from the river of money that he controlled. He managed to maintain this delicate balance for decades, playing the role of the indispensable mediator, the neutral arbiter whose only bias was towards profit. This intricate web of financial channels, coded communication, and psychological insight was what made him so elusive. The FBI could watch his home. They could track his movements. They could even arrest his lieutenants. But they could never quite grasp the entirety of the mechanism. They were trying to catch smoke with their bare hands. Every time they thought they had a solid lead, it would dissolve into a maze of corporate paperwork and hearsay. The system was designed to be fault tolerant. The failure of one component, the arrest of one courier or one accountant, would not lead back to the core. It was a decentralized, resilient network, decades ahead of its time. This was the true takedown of the commission. Not a single dramatic event, but the slow, painstaking, and ultimately incomplete process of dismantling this brilliant, malevolent machine. One encrypted conversation and one laundered dollar at a time. The psychological portrait of Meyer Lansky is a study in profound and seemingly irreconcilable contradictions. A man who built his entire identity upon a foundation of internal conflict that he managed with ruthless discipline. To understand the engine that drove this complex machine, one must look beyond the financial ledgers and the organizational charts and into the mind of the man himself, a landscape where calculated coldness coexisted with a deep-seated need for belonging and respect. At his core, Lansky was a man perpetually at war with his own nature and his place in the world. The most glaring of these contradictions was his dual identity as both a devoted family man and the architect of an empire steeped in violence and corruption. By all accounts, he was a loving, even doting, husband to his wife Anna, and a deeply involved father to his 3 children, Paul, Buddy, and Sandra. He craved for them a life of normalcy, stability, and respectability, a life completely insulated from the dark underworld he inhabited. He attended parent-teacher conferences, helped with homework, and insisted on family dinners. He presented himself as a humble, hard-working businessman, and for many years, his family genuinely believed this fiction. This domestic life was not a front, it was a sanctuary, a carefully constructed bubble of normality, where he could temporarily escape the brutal calculations of his professional life. Yet, the same man who kissed his children goodnight would, in the same evening, calmly authorize the murder of a business partner who had become a liability, or oversee the counting of millions of dollars stolen from the nation's tax coffers. He was able to compartmentalize his existence with a chilling efficiency, erecting an impenetrable mental wall between the world of his family and the world of his crimes. This ability to segregate his emotions was his greatest strength and his most profound human failing. Another fundamental conflict was his relationship with his Jewish heritage. Lansky was fiercely proud of being Jewish, and saw himself, in a twisted way, as a defender of his people. He used his wealth to make significant, albeit quiet, donations to Jewish charities and to the cause of Israeli independence. He famously told an associate, "We're going to make sure that what happened in Germany never happens again." He saw his accumulation of power and wealth as a form of empowerment for a community that had so often been victimized. He would often hire Jewish immigrants, giving them jobs in his legitimate fronts and offering protection from the anti-Semitic prejudices of the era. In his mind, he was a modern-day King David, using the tools at his disposal to protect his tribe. However, this self-justification was starkly at odds with the reality of his actions. The vast criminal enterprise he helped build, dealing in narcotics that destroyed communities, operating prostitution rings, and corrupting public institutions, caused immeasurable suffering to countless people, many of them from the very immigrant and minority communities he purported to champion. His operations brought shame and unwanted scrutiny upon the Jewish community, fueling the very stereotypes and prejudices he claimed to be fighting against. He funded a Jewish homeland through money earned from exploiting human misery, a moral compromise of breathtaking scale. This internal dissonance seemed to never trouble him outwardly. His logic was too powerful, his belief in the ends justifying the means too deeply ingrained. The third great contradiction was his relationship with power itself. Lansky had a deep-seated disdain for the flashy, ostentatious displays of wealth and influence favored by gangsters like Al Capone. He believed their vanity was a strategic weakness, a beacon that attracted law enforcement. His own power was derived from its invisibility. He found his satisfaction not in public adulation or fear, but in the private knowledge that he was the smartest man in the room, that he had outthought everyone else. He was an intellectual narcissist who took immense pride in his ability to solve complex problems and manage volatile personalities. This craving for intellectual supremacy was the drug that fueled him far more than the money itself. Yet, this very desire to be the unseen puppet master created a deep sense of frustration. He watched as less intelligent, more brutish men became household names and cultural anti-heroes, while he, the true architect, remained in the shadows, unknown and uncredited. He believed his system was a work of genius, and genius, in his view, deserved recognition, even if only from a select few. This need for acknowledgement from his peers was the one vanity he allowed himself. In the confidential meetings of the commission, his word was law, not because he commanded an army of killers, but because everyone knew he was the only one who could make the numbers work for everyone. That respect, the silent deference paid to his intellect, was the only trophy he truly coveted. In his final years, as his world collapsed and he became a reclusive, sickly old man, these contradictions likely became his constant companions. The family man saw his children grapple with the horrifying truth of their father's legacy. The defender of the Jewish people was denied refuge by the Jewish state. The intellectual mastermind was reduced to fighting endless, draining legal battles over tax returns and immigration status. The man who had controlled hundreds of millions died with a fraction of that wealth, his legendary fortune having evaporated like a mirage. The ultimate tragedy of Meyer Lansky is that the very qualities that made him a king, his intellect, his discipline, his ability to compartmentalize, were the same qualities that ensured his isolation. He was a prisoner of his own brilliant, calculating mind, a mind that could build an empire but could never find a way to truly enjoy it or escape the moral vacuum at its center. He was the ghost in his own machine, a legend whose greatest trick was convincing the world he was a simple accountant, while secretly knowing he was the CEO of the American underworld, a title he carried with a mixture of immense pride and profound, unacknowledged loneliness. The long, cold shadow cast by Meyer Lansky stretches far beyond the grave, influencing not only the subsequent generations of organized crime, but also permanently altering the tactics and priorities of law enforcement and international finance. His life served as a dark educational blueprint, a graduate-level course in the methodology of building and concealing a criminal enterprise, and his students were the next wave of mob bosses, drug lords, and ultimately the architects of cybercrime. The corporate model he imposed upon the American Mafia became its standard operating procedure for decades. The clear separation between the insulated, untouchable boss, the operational capos, and the street-level soldiers was a direct implementation of his corporate hierarchy. The concept of a kitty, or a central fund for legal defenses, bribes, and family support became a staple of organized crime families, ensuring organizational loyalty and resilience when new criminal opportunities arose, such as the massive heroin trade of the 1970s or the cocaine explosion of the 1980s. The smuggling and distribution networks used were refined versions of the systems Lansky had perfected during Prohibition, using legitimate shipping channels, corrupt officials at ports of entry, and layered transportation networks to move product. The Colombian cartels and Mexican drug trafficking organizations, while more overtly violent, adopted his principles of international logistics and money laundering on an even grander scale, using everything from commercial airlines to semi-submersible vessels, and funneling billions through complex networks of currency exchanges and shell companies. His influence is eerily evident in the modern era of digital crime. The dark web markets that operate today, with their encrypted communications, anonymous cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, and escrow services for illicit transactions, are the direct philosophical descendants of Lansky's operational playbook. He was the original advocate for operating in the shadows, for using technology and financial innovation to stay ahead of the law. A modern cyber criminal selling stolen data or ransomware services is employing the same principle of deniable plausibility that Lansky mastered. They are a username on a server, a wallet address on a blockchain, a ghost in the machine, just as he was a silent partner in a seemingly legitimate corporation. The same psychological insights he used to manage volatile gangsters are now used by criminal syndicates to recruit and manage hackers, financiers, and corrupt insiders. On the other side of the law, The ghost of Lansky fundamentally reshaped the American justice system. The failure to convict him on major charges, despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence of his guilt, was a searing humiliation for the FBI and the Department of Justice. It exposed critical weaknesses in the legal framework for combating sophisticated, white-collar financial crime. This failure was the primary catalyst for some of the most powerful legal tools now in the prosecutor's arsenal. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, signed into law in 1970, was designed explicitly to attack the very kind of criminal enterprise Lansky had built. Before RICO, prosecutors had to target individuals for specific, discrete crimes. RICO allowed them to target the entire organization as a continuing criminal enterprise, proving a pattern of racketeering activity rather than a single murder or theft. It is nearly impossible to imagine the successful prosecutions of mafia families in the 1980s and 1990s, from the Commission case to John Gotti, without the RICO statute, a statute born from the necessity of dismantling a system architected by Meyer Lansky. Similarly, the Money Laundering Control Act of 1986 made the very process of concealing the origins of illicit funds a standalone federal crime. This was a direct legislative response to the financial alchemy Lansky had perfected. The global pursuit of his hidden fortune also drove international cooperation on financial transparency. The painstaking efforts to pierce the veil of Swiss banking secrecy in his case paved the way for later treaties and agreements, such as the Foreign Account Tax Compliance, FATCA, and the Common Reporting Standard, CRS, which have made it increasingly difficult for individuals to hide assets overseas. The entire profession of financial forensic accounting, with its specialists who follow the money through a maze of transactions, owes its prominence to the challenge posed by criminals of Lansky's caliber. He forced governments to create entirely new disciplines and agencies dedicated to following the digital paper trail he so expertly obscured. His legacy is therefore a paradoxical one. He was a man who sought to create a perfect, untouchable criminal system, and in doing so, he inadvertently engineered the very mechanisms that would make that system obsolete for those who followed in his footsteps. He was the pathogen that forced the body to develop a stronger immune system. Every time a bank files a suspicious activity report, every time a prosecutor brings a RICO case, every time an international task force seizes a cryptocurrency wallet linked to a dark web market, they are engaging in a battle that was first defined by the methods of Meyer Lansky. He demonstrated that the greatest threat to a society is not the street-level thug, but the sophisticated intellectual who can weaponize the financial system itself. His story is a permanent warning that the rule of law is perpetually in a race against the ingenuity of those who would seek to undermine it for profit, and that the battlefield is no longer just the streets, but the sprawling, borderless, and often invisible landscape of global capital. The takedown of his commission was never truly complete because the ideas he embedded into the criminal psyche of corporatization, of financial obfuscation, of operating in the seams of the legal system, are ideas that continue to evolve and challenge the forces of order to this very day. As we reach the final reckoning of Meyer Lansky's life and legacy, we are left not with a simple conclusion, but with a haunting and unresolved echo, a series of questions that continue to defy clear answers. The man himself is gone, but the enigma he so carefully cultivated remains, challenging historians, journalists, and law enforcement to this day. The central mystery, the one that fuels endless speculation and countless investigations, is the ultimate disposition of his vast fortune. Where did the hundreds of millions of dollars, the profits from a lifetime of building the underworld's financial infrastructure, truly go? The official narrative, the one presented in probate court after his death, painted a picture of a man of modest means. His estate was valued at a little over $50,000, a sum so laughably small for a man of his alleged influence that it can only be interpreted as the final, masterful stroke of his deception. There are several prevailing theories, each more intriguing than the last, about the fate of the Lansky millions. The first theory is that the money was largely mythical, inflated by his own legend and the fear he inspired. Proponents of this idea argue that while he controlled immense cash flows, the operational costs of his empire, bribes, legal fees, payroll for hundreds of associates, and the high-risk nature of his businesses meant that his personal share, while substantial, was not the astronomical figure often quoted. They point to the immense cost of his legal defenses and the loss of his Cuban investments as events that genuinely decimated his personal wealth. The second and more widely believed theory is that the fortune was not lost, but was successfully hidden in a manner so effective that it has never been recovered. This theory posits that Lansky, anticipating his own mortality and the relentless pursuit of the government, executed a final, brilliant plan to secure his family's future. This would have involved moving the wealth into a series of irrevocable trusts, complex offshore foundations, or corporate entities in jurisdictions with impenetrable secrecy laws, with instructions for the assets to be managed and slowly distributed to his heirs by a trusted, anonymous third party, a keyholder who would never reveal their role. The money could have been converted into bearer bonds, diamonds, or other untraceable valuables and stored in private vaults in Singapore, Hong Kong, or Liechtenstein. The third, and most chilling theory, is that the money was never meant to be found because it had already achieved its purpose. In this scenario, Lansky's goal was not to amass a hoard of treasure for his descendants, but to achieve something far more profound, the ultimate legitimization of his legacy. He may have used his final years to quietly and systematically donate the bulk of his wealth to charitable causes, particularly those related to Jewish heritage and the state of Israel, laundering his reputation along with his money. A large, anonymous donation to a university, a hospital, or a museum would stand as a permanent, untraceable monument to his success, allowing him to posthumously reshape his image from a notorious gangster into a mysterious, philanthropic benefactor. This would have been the ultimate skim, not from a casino, but from history itself, purifying his name with the one thing that commands respect in the legitimate world philanthropic capital. Beyond the mystery of the money, his personal life after his legal defeats offers a poignant and tragic coda. The last years were a portrait of a king stripped of his kingdom, living in a state of quiet, paranoid isolation. He was a spectral figure in Miami Beach, a frail old man with a bad heart, often seen sitting on a park bench or visiting his wife's grave. The phone in his simple apartment, once the nerve center of a criminal consortium, now rang rarely. The stream of powerful, furtive visitors had dried up, replaced by the constant, oppressive awareness of federal surveillance. He spent his days reading, following the news, and likely ruminating on the colossal structure he had built and seen eroded. The man who had dined with dictators and shaped the skyline of Las Vegas was now reduced to worrying about medical bills and immigration hearings. The psychological toll must have been immense. The brilliant mind that had once juggled a dozen complex financial schemes across the globe was now focused on the mundane and the tragic. His son, Buddy, suffered from severe cerebral palsy, and Lansky's concern for his child's future well-being was a constant and genuine source of anxiety. The father, who had wanted to provide a wall of normalcy for his family, saw that wall crumble. As the world learned the true identity of the quiet man down the street, the final irony of his life is that the very thing he sought to avoid, notoriety, became his posthumous fate. He is now immortalized, not as the anonymous genius he aspired to be, but as a legendary, almost mythical figure, the archetype of the criminal mastermind. His story is a dark American fairy tale, a warning and a fascination. He is a proof of concept that the system can be beaten, that a man can operate above the law for a lifetime, but also a testament to the ultimate emptiness of that victory. Meyer Lansky conquered the American underworld, but he could not conquer his own mortality, his own isolation, or the relentless march of time that rendered his methods obsolete and his fortune a ghost. He died as he lived, a paradox, an enigma, a man who calculated every variable except for the cost to his own soul. The takedown was never about a single arrest or conviction. It was about the slow, inexorable process of a life spent in the shadows, a life that, in the end, found the darkness to be a lonely and inescapable prison. The enduring fascination with Meyer Lansky transcends the mere facts of his criminal enterprises and taps into something deeper within the human psyche, a collective captivation with the archetype of the Shadow King, the power behind the throne, the intellect that can bend the world to its will without ever stepping into the light. His story resonates because it is not a simple tale of good versus evil, but a complex narrative about ambition, intelligence, and the American dream distorted through a prism of illegitimacy. He is the dark counterpart to the classic Horatio Alger myth. He did not pull himself up by his bootstraps through hard work and moral fortitude, but through ruthless calculation and a brilliant, immoral mind. He achieved the ultimate immigrant success story, but in a parallel, hidden America that operated just beneath the surface of the legitimate one. This duality makes him a perpetually compelling figure, a subject of endless analysis in books, documentaries, and even academic seminars. What is it about this quiet, unassuming man that continues to command our attention decades after his death? Part of the answer lies in the sheer audacity of his ambition. He did not merely want to be rich. He wanted to redesign the very ecosystem of American crime, to impose order upon chaos, and he succeeded on a scale that is almost incomprehensible. He built a nation within a nation, with its own laws, its own economy, and its own system of justice. We are fascinated by creators, by builders, and Lansky was a master builder, albeit of a sinister edifice. Furthermore, his life forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of power and success in a capitalist society. In the legitimate world, he would have been celebrated as a visionary CEO, a financial genius who revolutionized industries. His strategies: vertical integration, corporate structuring, international expansion, risk management, are straight out of a Harvard business school textbook. The only difference is that his product was illicit. This blurring of the lines between the corporate titan and the crime lord challenges are neatly defined categories of respectability and criminality. It suggests that the skills required to succeed at the highest levels of both worlds are eerily similar, and that the gap between them may be narrower than we care to admit. Lansky holds up a dark mirror to our celebration of wealth and power, forcing us to ask, where do we draw the line? His story is also a timeless tragedy in the classical sense. He was a man of immense talent and drive whose fatal flaw was his own hubris, the belief that his intellect could insulate him from all consequences, that he could create a system so perfect it would be immune to the frailties of human emotion and the relentless pressure of the state. His downfall was not a single event, but a slow, grinding process of isolation and erosion, the walls of his labyrinth slowly closing in. He achieved everything he set out to accomplish, only to find the victory hollow. The fortune was hidden or gone. The power had evaporated. His friends were dead or imprisoned, and he was left alone, a sick old man fighting deportation. This arc from the tenements of the Lower East Side to the pinnacle of hidden power, and then down to a lonely, paranoid existence in Miami Beach has the elements of a Shakespearean drama. He is a figure of pathos as much as he is of fear. We see the human cost of a life lived in the shadows, the price paid for such absolute control. The family he sought to protect was ultimately scarred by his legacy. The respectability he craved was forever out of reach. This human dimension, the glimpse of the lonely man behind the legend, adds a layer of complexity that prevents us from dismissing him as a mere monster. He becomes a tragic, flawed, and terrifyingly competent human being. Finally, Lansky endures because he represents an unsolved puzzle. The mystery of his missing millions is a real, life treasure hunt that continues to tantalize. The full extent of his dealings with the CIA regarding potential assassination plots against Fidel Castro remains shrouded in classified documents. The true depth of his influence on American politics through his union control and his connections to figures like Joseph Kennedy, Sir, is still a subject of intense debate among historians. He is a historical figure whose file is never truly closed. New information occasionally trickles out from declassified documents or from the memoirs of aging associates, each piece offering a potential new clue, but never the full picture. He designed his life to be an enigma, and in that, he succeeded spectacularly. We are drawn to mysteries, to stories that lack a neat and tidy ending. And the life of Meyer Lansky is the ultimate unfinished story. He is the ghost in the machine of American history, a reminder that the official narrative is often just the surface, and that beneath it flow powerful, hidden currents shaped by men who understood that true power lies not in the spotlight, but in the silence that surrounds it. His legacy is a permanent question mark, a challenge to our understanding of the past, and a warning for the future about the enduring allure and the ultimate emptiness of a life built on a foundation of secrets and lies. To fully appreciate the operational genius of Meyer Lansky, one must dissect a single, representative enterprise from his vast portfolio. And there is no better example than the intricate financial and logistical machine he built around the Molluska Corporation, a seemingly legitimate entity that served as the clandestine heart of his rum, running operations during the latter years of Prohibition. This was not a simple bootlegging ring. It was a vertically integrated multinational corporation, designed and managed with a sophistication that rivaled any legitimate business of its time. And it perfectly encapsulates the Lansky method of layering legitimacy over illegality to create a nearly impervious shield. The genesis of Molluska was a problem of scale and efficiency. As the demand for high-quality imported liquor grew exponentially, the ad hoc system of relying on independent rum runners became too risky and unreliable. Losses from Coast Guard interdiction, hijackings by rival gangs, and the unpredictability of weather were eating into profits. Lansky's solution was to bring the entire supply chain under a single corporate umbrella. The Molluska Corporation was incorporated with impeccable legal paperwork. It listed its business as the import and export of industrial alcohol and other chemicals, a perfect cover for the transportation of pure grain alcohol and Scotch whiskey. Its offices were in a respectable building. Its stationery was professionally printed, and it employed secretaries and accountants who performed legitimate clerical work, completely unaware of the company's true purpose. The brilliance of Molluska lay in its compartmentalized structure. The corporation owned a fleet of fast, seaworthy vessels, officially registered as commercial freighters. These ships, with names like the Star of Maine and the Coastal Trader, would make the transatlantic journey to Scotland, where they would load up with genuine, high-quality Scotch from distilleries that were willing to look the other way for the right price. The bills of lading would meticulously describe the cargo as machine parts or textile manufacturing equipment, creating a false paper trail from the very beginning. Once the ships crossed into international waters off the coast of the United States, the real operation began. Lansky had established a network of hidden coves, and deserted inlets along the coast of Long Island and New Jersey, far from the prying eyes of authorities in major ports. Here, the mother ships would anchor, and a secondary fleet, commanded by the fearless and relentless Bugsy Siegel, would spring into action. These were the contact boats, low-slung, powerful speedboats equipped with surplus aircraft engines, capable of outrunning any Coast Guard cutter of the era. Under the cover of darkness, and often in fall weather, Siegel and his men would pull alongside the freighter, and the dangerous, precise work of transferring the cargo would begin. Hundreds of cases of liquor would be swiftly lowered into the speedboats until they were riding low in the water. Then, with a roar of their engines, they would disappear into the night, navigating by predetermined routes to avoid patrols. This is where Lansky's logistical planning reached its zenith. The landing points were never the same twice in a row. They used a system of signal lights from the shore, a single lantern in a farmhouse window, a specific pattern of car headlights on a cliffside road to confirm that the coast was clear. Upon landing, the third layer of the operation took over, the trucking network. The cases were immediately transferred to a fleet of unmarked trucks, owned by a separate shell company that had a legitimate contract with Alaska to transport chemical drums. These trucks would then fan out, not to speakeasies, but to a series of secret warehouses in the basements of buildings in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and New Jersey. These warehouses were the final piece of the puzzle, the distribution hubs where the product was quality, checked, repackaged if necessary, and then sold to the thousands of speakeasy owners and independent distributors who formed the retail end of the operation. The financial flow was just as carefully engineered. Payments from the speakeasies were collected in cash by a separate team of couriers who had no connection to the maritime or trucking operations. This cash was then funneled through a series of counting houses where it was tallied and prepared for laundering. Lansky used Alaska's legitimate front to launder a significant portion of these profits. The company would issue inflated invoices to the speakeasies for industrial cleaning supplies or chemical solvents, providing a seemingly legitimate reason for the large cash deposits it made into its bank accounts. The rest of the untaxed cash was skimmed off and funneled directly to the syndicate's leaders, funding their lavish lifestyles and their investments in other criminal ventures. The entire Alaska operation was a masterpiece of operational security. The men on the ships knew nothing about the truck drivers. The truck drivers knew nothing about the warehouse locations. The warehouse managers knew only their immediate contacts. The entire system was designed so that if any one part was compromised, if a speedboat was captured or a warehouse raided, it could not lead investigators back to the core of the organization. This compartmentalization, this corporate structuring of a criminal enterprise, was Lansky's revolutionary contribution. He didn't just run a bootlegging ring. He managed a corporation whose product happened to be illegal alcohol. The Alaska Corporation operated with such efficiency and secrecy that despite the best efforts of the Prohibition Bureau, it was never successfully penetrated or shut down. It served as the financial engine for Lansky's growing empire throughout the 1920s, generating the immense capital that would later be used to fund his ventures in Las Vegas and Havana. It was, in microcosm, the entire Lansky story, a quiet, unassuming exterior hiding a complex, brilliant, and ruthlessly efficient machine, a machine that proved, beyond any doubt, that crime could indeed pay, and pay handsomely, if it was run like a business. The narrative of Meyer Lansky's life would be incomplete without a deep examination of his complex and often paradoxical relationship with his longtime partner and eventual victim, Bugsy, Siegel, a relationship that serves as a powerful case study in the clash between cold-eyed business rationale and volatile, visionary ambition. This partnership, forged in the fire of their youth on the streets of New York, was a classic symbiotic union of opposites. Lansky, the cerebral and dispassionate strategist who operated from the shadows, and Siegel, the charismatic, dangerously handsome, and explosively violent enforcer who thrived in the spotlight and commanded fear through his sheer presence and unpredictable temper. For decades, their bond was the engine of the syndicate's most daring operations. Siegel was Lansky's sword, the one sent to resolve disputes with ruthless efficiency, to intimidate rivals into submission, and to command the high-risk, high-reward ventures like the transcontinental drug trade and the fledgling operations in Los Angeles. Lansky trusted Siegel's loyalty and his nerve implicitly, and in return, Siegel revered Lansky's intellect, understanding that his friend's mind was the true source of their power and wealth. This mutual respect and dependence formed one of the most formidable alliances in the history of organized crime, a partnership that seemed unbreakable. The fissure that would ultimately shatter this decade's long bond began with a dream, a vision that initially captivated both men, but would eventually pit Lansky's pragmatism against Siegel's obsession. That vision was Las Vegas. It was Siegel who first saw the potential of the Nevada desert, not just as a site for casinos, but as a glittering, world-class destination, an American Monte Carlo. He poured his own passion and a significant portion of the syndicate's money into the Flamingo Hotel, a project that was supposed to be the crown jewel of their empire. Initially, Lansky was a silent partner, supportive of the venture and funneling millions in mob capital into the construction. He understood the strategic value of a legalized gambling haven. However, as the project progressed, the fundamental differences in their approaches became a chasm. Lansky, the ultimate accountant, watched with growing alarm as the budget for the Flamingo spiraled catastrophically out of control. Siegel, the perfectionist visionary, was obsessed with creating a palace of unparalleled luxury. He demanded the finest materials, imported Italian marble, the most expensive French furniture, gold-plated bathroom fixtures. He insisted on building a state of the art water system and power plant for the hotel, costs that ballooned with every passing month. To Lansky, this was not vision, it was fiscal insanity. It was a violation of every principle. He lived by efficiency, profit, and the careful management of risk. The Flamingo was becoming a bottomless pit, swallowing syndicate money at an alarming rate. And Siegel's notoriously short temper made him impossible to reason with. He surrounded himself with yes men in Hollywood and dismissed the concerns of his old partners back east as the worries of small-minded bookkeepers. The final straw was the Flamingo's disastrous initial opening in December 1946. Plagued by bad weather that grounded the Hollywood celebrities Siegel had counted on for publicity, and with the casino itself not even fully completed, the opening was a financial catastrophe. The high rollers who did come lost heavily at the tables, and the Flamingo blood money from its very first night. In the cold, calculating boardroom of the syndicate, the Flamingo was no longer a visionary project. It was a failing asset, and Siegel was the failing manager. A crisis meeting was convened. Lansky, ever the pragmatist, was faced with the most difficult decision of his life. It was a choice between sentiment and business, between a lifelong friendship and the financial security of the organization he had helped build. The other bosses, like Luciano and Frank Costello, were furious, their investments evaporating due to what they saw as Siegel's arrogance and incompetence. They demanded a solution. Lansky, after a period of silent deliberation, ultimately gave his consent. The decision was not made out of personal malice, but from a cold, dispassionate assessment of the balance sheet. Siegel's emotional attachment to the Flamingo had compromised his judgment, and in doing so, he had become a liability to the entire corporation. In the world they inhabited, liabilities were eliminated. The murder of Benjamin Siegel on the evening of June 20, 1947, as he sat on a sofa in his girlfriend's Beverly Hills home, was the ultimate enforcement of corporate policy. It was a stark, brutal message that no one, not even a founding member, was above the bottom line. For Lansky, it was a profoundly defining moment. It cemented his reputation as a man utterly devoid of sentiment when it came to business, a man who would sacrifice his closest friend for the good of the organization. It was the final, terrible proof of his childhood belief: in a brutal world, you must be willing to wield the hammer, no matter the personal cost. The ghost of Bugsy Siegel would forever haunt the legend of Meyer Lansky, a permanent stain on his legacy and a chilling reminder that the empire he built was sustained not only by numbers and ledgers, but by blood and absolute, ruthless resolve. The final, lingering mystery that has captivated the world for decades and truly encapsulates the enigmatic ghost of Meyer Lansky is the ultimate fate of his legendary fortune. A puzzle that has consumed journalists, federal agents, and treasure hunters alike, transforming the pursuit of his wealth into a modern, day grail quest. The official records, the probate filings after his death in 1983, presented a narrative that was so starkly at odds with his mythos that it seemed like a deliberate, final act of misdirection. The man reputed to be worth over $300 million, a sum worth well over $1 billion in today's currency, was declared to have left an estate valued at a paltry $57,000. This was not merely a discrepancy, it was an impossibility, a statistical absurdity that could only be the result of a lifetime of preparation for this very moment, the ultimate vanishing act. The question of where the money went has spawned a multitude of theories, each with its own compelling logic and its own dead ends. The first and most straightforward theory is that the fortune was systematically dismantled by the immense costs of his later life. The decade-long legal battles against the IRS and the Immigration Service were fought with the most expensive lawyers in America, a financial drain that could have consumed millions. The catastrophic loss of his Cuban investments, estimated at $7 to $10 million, was a direct hit to his liquid capital. Furthermore, the simple cost of living his life, of maintaining his network of informants and associates, of paying the endless bribes and retainers that kept his world functioning, would have been a constant, massive outflow of cash. Proponents of this theory argue that the legend of his wealth simply outstripped the reality, that by the time the government was done with him, there was simply very little left. A second, more sinister theory suggests that the money was never truly his to keep in a personal sense. As the chief financial officer of the syndicate, a significant portion of the capital he managed was corporate wealth belonging to the organization and its various families. When his power waned and he was effectively pushed out of the inner circle in his final years, access to these vast reserves was simply cut off. The money remained, but it was now controlled by a new generation of bosses who had no loyalty to an old, sick man who was attracting too much heat. In this version, Lansky died not as a pauper, but as a former CEO who had been forced into retirement and had his stock options voided. The third, and most widely believed theory, is that the fortune was not lost at all, but was hidden with a brilliance that has so far proven unmatched. This theory posits that Lansky, anticipating his own mortality and the government's relentless pursuit, spent his final active years engineering the perfect concealment of his assets. This would not have involved a single Swiss bank account, but a dizzying array of financial instruments and hiding places. The money could have been converted into bearer bonds, diamonds, or gold bullion and stored in private, anonymous vaults in jurisdictions like Liechtenstein, Singapore, or Hong Kong. It could have been placed into a series of irrevocable trusts and complex offshore foundations, with the assets legally owned by impenetrable corporate entities registered in the Bahamas or the Cayman Islands. The distribution of these assets would have been governed by a set of secret instructions given to a single, utterly trustworthy key-holder, perhaps a Swiss lawyer or a retired banker who would manage the fortune and make controlled disbursements to Lansky's heirs over generations, ensuring their financial security while maintaining total deniability. This method would explain why his family never seemed to access a massive fortune. The payments would have been structured to look like legitimate annuities or investment income, avoiding any sudden, suspicious wealth. There are even more exotic theories that he secretly invested in the nascent technology boom of the 1970s, buying up early stakes in companies whose value would later explode, or that he used his old CIA connections from the Castro assassination plots to create a new identity and transfer the wealth into it. A fortune waiting for a man who no longer existed. The most poignant theory, and one that aligns with his complex personality, is that he used his final years to engage in a massive, secret act of philanthropy, anonymously donating the bulk of his wealth to Jewish charities, hospitals, and yeshivas. This would have been the ultimate laundering, not of money, but of his soul. It would have been a final, desperate attempt to secure a legacy of respectability and to atone for a lifetime of sin. To be remembered not as the mob's accountant, but as a mysterious, benevolent benefactor to his people. The truth likely lies in a combination of these scenarios. A portion was undoubtedly lost to legal battles and the collapse of Cuba. Another portion was likely reclaimed by the syndicate. But a significant core of his personal wealth, the fruit of a lifetime of unparalleled financial genius, was almost certainly hidden away, dispersed across the globe in a labyrinth so complex that its map died with him. The enduring mystery of Lansky's millions is his final and greatest triumph. It is a monument to his belief that intellect could always outmaneuver force, that a perfectly executed plan could defy even the grave. He proved that money could be made to disappear, leaving behind only a ghost, a legend, and a question that we are still asking today. Where, in the vast, silent machinery of the world's financial system, does the treasure of Meyer Lansky sleep, and who, if anyone, holds the key? The final years of Meyer Lansky's life were a protracted and somber epilogue, a slow-motion unraveling of a once indomitable spirit, played out not in the boardrooms of power, but in the sterile confines of courtrooms and the lonely silence of a modest Miami Beach apartment. This period, from the early 1970s until his death in 1983, was a masterclass in the slow, grinding pressure of the state, a battle of attrition that systematically stripped away his health, his wealth, and his will, leaving behind a shell of the man who had once commanded a global criminal empire. The legal victories he had scored, like the Mistral in the massive tax evasion case, were Pyrrhic. They had not secured his freedom so much as they had prolonged his siege. The government, humiliated and enraged by its inability to convict him on its own terms, shifted its strategy to a multi-pronged war of bureaucratic annihilation. The Immigration and Naturalization Service became a primary weapon. Having never become a naturalized U.S. citizen, Lansky was technically an alien, and the government initiated deportation proceedings with the stated goal of sending him back to his country of origin. The thought of being deported, of being formally cast out from the nation he had helped shape in its shadowy underbelly, was a profound and personal humiliation that struck at the very core of his identity as a self-made American. He fought the deportation with every legal tool at his disposal, a complex and draining battle that wound its way through a labyrinth of immigration courts for years. The case itself was a spectacle, with the government painting him as a pervasive threat to national security and Lansky's lawyers arguing that he was a sickly old man being persecuted for a reputation, not for proven crimes. The psychological toll was immense. The constant, oppressive surveillance continued. Federal agents were a permanent fixture outside his home, their cars a familiar eyesore, their presence a relentless reminder that he was a specimen under a microscope. His every move, his every visitor, his every grocery purchase meticulously recorded. The phone in his apartment, once the secure nerve center of a criminal consortium, was now widely believed to be tapped, rendering it useless for any meaningful conversation. The stream of powerful, furtive associates who had once sought his counsel had long since dried up, replaced by a paranoid isolation. To contact him was to attract the immediate attention of the FBI, and in the underworld, that was a contagion no one was willing to risk. He was a pariah, a king whose court had abandoned him. His health, always precarious, began a steep and irreversible decline. The stress of a lifetime spent looking over his shoulder, compounded by the legal battles and the isolation, exacerbated a chronic heart condition and other ailments. The brilliant mind that had once juggled a dozen complex financial schemes across the globe was now preoccupied with medical appointments, medication schedules, and the gnawing anxiety about his family's future. His son, Buddy, required constant and expensive care for his cerebral palsy, and Lansky's inability to secure the vast fortune he had hidden to provide for his son's long-term well-being must have been a source of deep private anguish. The father who had wanted to build an impenetrable wall of security and normalcy for his family saw that wall crumble into dust. In a final desperate and deeply ironic move, he applied for Israeli citizenship under the law of return, which grants any Jew the right to settle in Israel. For a brief moment, it seemed he might find a final refuge in the Jewish homeland, a bitter twist of fate for a man who had built his empire on activities that were illegal in the very state he now sought sanctuary in. But the Israeli government, under intense diplomatic pressure from the United States and wary of importing the world's most famous gangster, ultimately denied his application. The Supreme Court of Israel upheld the decision, stating that a person with a long criminal record could not be considered a Jew who was living a Jewish life, consistent with the values of the state. He was trapped, a man without a country, besieged in his own adopted home. The last public images of him are haunting. A frail, shrunken old man with a gaunt face, being helped in and out of courtrooms or hospitals, his once piercing eyes now clouded with pain and fatigue. The sharp suits were replaced by simple, ill-fitting clothing. The confident, measured stride was reduced to a slow, careful shuffle. The king of the underworld had been reduced to a sick, lonely pensioner, fighting not for his empire, but for his right to simply die in his own bed. He spent his final days in a small, nondescript apartment, a world away from the opulent casinos and presidential suites he had once owned. The great fortune, the hidden billions, had become a phantom, irrelevant to the daily realities of his existence. On January 15, 1983, Meyer Lansky died of lung cancer in a Miami hospital at the age of 80. There was no deathbed confession, no dramatic revelation of hidden treasures or secret bank account numbers. He took the full, unvarnished truth of his life, his empire, and his fortune with him to the grave. His death was not the end of his story, but the final, masterful act of obfuscation in a life defined by it. He had outlived most of his contemporaries. He had beaten the most serious criminal charges, and he had denied the world the satisfaction of a definitive conclusion. In death, as in life, Meyer Lansky remained an enigma, a ghost in the machine he himself had built, the ultimate testament to a mind that believed it could calculate its way around any obstacle, even the final, inevitable accounting of mortality itself. To truly measure the impact of Meyer Lansky, one must look beyond the immediate sphere of organized crime and into the very fabric of 20th century American history, where his influence, though hidden, acted as a subtle but powerful undercurrent shaping events from the shadows. His was not the visible hand of a politician or a general, but the invisible hand of a financier and strategist whose decisions rippled outward, affecting foreign policy, domestic economics, and the cultural landscape in ways that are still being unraveled by historians. The most startling and well-documented example of this far-reaching influence was his deep involvement with the American government's clandestine efforts to overthrow Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. This partnership, born of a shared enemy, stands as one of the most bizarre and cynical alliances in the annals of U.S. intelligence. When Castro marched into Havana in 1959 and shuttered the mob's multi-million-dollar casino empire, he didn't just cost Lansky a fortune. He declared war on the syndicate's most profitable foreign enterprise. The loss was catastrophic, but Lansky's response was not one of mere vengeance. It was a calculated strategic pivot. He understood that the U.S. government, embroiled in the Cold War, viewed Castro's alignment with the Soviet Union as an existential threat. Lansky and his associates, including Santos Traficante Jr., the mob's boss in Cuba, saw an opportunity. They possessed invaluable assets the CIA desperately needed, detailed knowledge of the Cuban underworld, a network of contacts on the island, and, most importantly, a proven willingness to use unsanctioned violence. Through a series of clandestine meetings, often brokered by shadowy figures like former FBI agent Robert Mahayu, an offer was made the mob would use its resources to assassinate Fidel Castro. In return, they wanted a guarantee that once Castro was removed, their casino licenses and criminal enterprises would be restored under a new, USU-friendly regime. The CIA, under President Eisenhower and later President Kennedy, agreed. This unholy alliance set in motion a series of comically inept yet deadly serious assassination plots that read like a spy thriller. The mob's proposed methods were pulled straight from their own brutal playbook, poisoning Castro's food, supplying him with exploding cigars, lacing his favorite milkshakes with toxic chemicals, and even recruiting a former lover to carry out the hit. Lansky himself was deeply involved in the planning, providing intelligence on Castro's movements and habits, gathered from his old contacts within the Cuban police and bureaucracy. While these specific plots failed, the collaboration itself is a matter of historical record. confirmed by subsequent congressional investigations like the Church Committee. This episode reveals the breathtaking audacity of Lansky's reach. Here was a man the U.S. government was simultaneously trying to imprison for tax evasion, yet whom another branch of that same government was actively recruiting as a covert asset for a regime change operation. It demonstrates that at the highest levels of power, pragmatism often trumps morality, and that Lansky's value as a ruthless problem solver was recognized even by his sworn enemies. His influence extended into the domestic political arena through his intricate control over labor unions. By infiltrating and corrupting key unions like the International Longshoremen's Association and the Teamsters, Lansky and the syndicate gained the power to paralyze the nation's ports and transportation networks. This was not merely a shakedown for protection money. It was a lever of immense economic and political power. They could ensure favorable contracts for businesses they owned or extorted. They could manipulate shipping costs, and they could deliver the votes of thousands of union members to politicians who were willing to look the other way on their activities. This union control provided a river of clean, laundered money through union pension funds, which were often invested in mob-backed ventures, including the early development of Las Vegas. The political donations and influence peddling that flowed from this control allowed the syndicate to build a protective wall of political corruption that stretched from city halls to the halls of Congress, insulating them from law enforcement for decades. Furthermore, Lansky's financial system fundamentally altered the relationship between crime and business in America. He was a pioneer in the concept of the legitimate front, proving that a criminal enterprise could not only hide behind a legitimate business, but could use that business to actively launder money and gain social standing. He normalized the presence of organized crime capital in the mainstream economy, blurring the lines between the underworld and the upper world. His methods were later adopted by drug cartels, Russian oligarchs, and cybercriminals, but he was the original architect. He demonstrated that the most successful criminal is not the one who operates outside the system, but the one who learns to parasitize it from within, using its own rules and institutions as a shield. The story of Meyer Lansky is therefore not a sidebar to American history. It is a central, if hidden, chapter. It is the story of how a single, brilliant, and immoral mind found the vulnerabilities in the American dream and exploited them to build a parallel nation, a shadow America that wielded real power over foreign policy, domestic commerce, and the lives of millions. He was a dark wizard of finance and a ruthless strategist whose legacy is not just a list of crimes, but a permanent scar on the nation's history, a reminder that the greatest threats to a society are often not the ones that announce themselves with a bang, but the ones that work silently in the counting rooms and back corridors of power, patiently building an empire you cannot see until it is already there. The story of Meyer Lansky cannot be confined to a simple chronology of events. It demands a deeper philosophical inquiry into the nature of his criminality, which was so refined so corporate, and so detached from the bloody, handed violence of his peers that it forces us to question the very definitions of guilt and innocence in a complex modern world. Lansky represented a new evolutionary stage in the development of the criminal archetype, a transition from the thuggish gangster to the executive criminal, a figure whose sins were not written in bloodstains on a city street, but in the invisible ink of complex financial transactions spread across the globe. His was a crime of the intellect, a cold, dispassionate exercise in resource allocation and risk management that operated on a scale so vast it became abstract, divorced from the human suffering it ultimately caused. This abstraction was the key to his psychological endurance and his moral flexibility. He never pulled a trigger. He never personally broke a kneecap. He never directly sold narcotics to an addict. His violence was outsourced. His corruption was systemic, and his product was often a vice that his customers willingly sought out, like alcohol or gambling. This allowed him to construct a powerful self-justifying narrative, one in which he was not a predator, but a service provider, a businessman catering to a demand that the government had foolishly or hypocritically made illegal. He saw himself as a logical operator in an illogical system, a rational man making the most of an irrational world. This self-perception is what separates him so starkly from a psychopathic killer like Albert Anastasia or a volatile egotist like Bugsy Siegel. His primary driver was not a lust for violence or a need for notoriety, but a deep, almost obsessive, compulsive need for order, control, and the quiet satisfaction of solving a complex problem. The world of his youth was chaotic and violent, a place where a Jewish boy could be attacked for no reason. He responded not by becoming more chaotic, but by imposing a rigid, mathematical order upon the chaos, creating a system where everything had its place and every action was calculated for maximum efficiency and minimum risk. This is why he was so repulsed by the flashy, reckless behavior of his associates. It introduced variables his equations could not control. His criminality was, in a twisted sense, a form of extreme rationalism, a belief that every human interaction, from a partnership to a murder, could be reduced to a cost-benefit analysis. This philosophical framework made him uniquely dangerous and uniquely elusive. The law, and indeed conventional morality, is built on the concept of direct action and intent. It is relatively straightforward to prosecute a man who is seen firing a gun. It is infinitely more difficult to prosecute the man who 3,000 miles away calculated the financial necessity of that murder and authorized the payment to the trigger man without ever speaking a direct command. Lansky mastered the art of creating distance, of insulating himself behind layers of bureaucracy and intermediaries, so that his own hands and his own conscience remained clinically clean. He was the architect, and architects do not lay the bricks, they simply draw the plans. This is why the government's case against him was so fraught with difficulty. They were trying to prosecute a ghost, a set of ideas and systems, rather than a man who had committed a discrete, provable act. His entire life was a challenge to the legal system's ability to comprehend and punish sophisticated, white-collar crime. He proved that in the modern world, the most profound criminal acts are not crimes of passion, but crimes of calculation, and that the most successful criminal is not the one who breaks the law most brazenly, but the one who manipulates the spaces between laws, who uses the tools of legitimacy as weapons of illegitimacy. This philosophical coldness extended to his personal relationships, which were often transactional. His friendship with Bugsy Siegel was deep and genuine, forged in the fires of their youth. Yet when Siegel's emotional attachment to the Flamingo threatened the financial stability of the entire syndicate, Lansky was able to clinically sever that friendship, reducing Siegel from a beloved brother to a failing asset that needed to be liquidated. There was no hatred in the decision, only a grim, dispassionate necessity. This ability to suppress sentiment in favor of the bottom line is the hallmark of a certain kind of corporate leadership, celebrated in the legitimate business world. In Lansky's world, it was a death sentence. His life, therefore, stands as a dark mirror to the ethos of American capitalism. He embraced its core tenets: competition, innovation, profit maximization, and corporate structuring, with a fervor that would have made any Wall Street titan proud. He was, in essence, a hyper-capitalist operating in a prohibited market. The only difference between him and John D. Rockefeller was the legality of their respective products. This uncomfortable parallel forces a difficult question. If the methods are the same, what is the moral distinction between a corporate monopoly that crushes competitors and a criminal syndicate that murders them? Lansky's philosophy suggests that the distinction is merely a legal technicality, a matter of which side of an arbitrary line one operates on. He saw the law not as a moral absolute, but as a set of arbitrary rules to be navigated and exploited. His entire empire was built on the premise that morality was a luxury, and that in the brutal, real-world struggle for power and security, the only true sin was inefficiency. This is the chilling, enduring legacy of his philosophical stance: a world where everything has a price, every principle is negotiable, and every human relationship is ultimately just another variable in the grand, calculating machine of self-interest. He was not a monster in the traditional sense. He was something perhaps more frightening for the modern age, a perfectly rational man who had simply reasoned his way beyond good and evil. The final, and perhaps most profound, layer to the story of Meyer Lansky is the human cost, the collateral damage left in the wake of his meticulously constructed empire, a toll paid not in abstract financial losses, but in shattered lives, broken families, and corrupted institutions. While Lansky himself remained insulated in his world of numbers and strategies, the real-world consequences of his system rippled outward, touching countless individuals who never knew his name but felt the weight of his decisions. To view his life solely through the lens of his intellectual achievements is to ignore the vast sea of human suffering that floated his empire. Consider the anonymous addict on the street, hooked on heroin that was smuggled into the country using the distribution networks Lansky helped perfect. The narcotics trade, which he and Luciano systematized on a global scale, was not a victimless crime. It was a plague that devastated communities, fueled street-level violence, and destroyed generations. Lansky could rationalize it as mere commerce, but for the families torn apart by addiction, it was a personal holocaust. Consider the dock worker whose union was infiltrated and corrupted by the syndicate, forcing him to kick back a portion of his hard-earned wages to mobsters he never saw, under the constant threat of violence if he complained. Consider the small business owner in New York or Chicago who was forced to pay protection money to a Lansky-affiliated gang, not for any real service, but for the privilege of not having his storefront smashed or his family threatened. This was the grim reality of the power structure Lansky financed, a pervasive system of intimidation and exploitation that preyed upon the working class and the vulnerable. The corruption extended deep into the heart of American democracy. The millions of dollars skimmed from Las Vegas casinos and funneled into the pockets of politicians, judges, and police chiefs created a culture of institutional rot that undermined public trust for decades. When a police officer looked the other way for a monthly envelope of cash, when a city councilman zoning approval for a mob-backed project, when a federal agent leaked information about an investigation, the very foundations of justice were eroded. Lansky's money didn't just buy silence, it bought active complicity, turning the guardians of society into its betrayers. This institutional corruption had a direct human impact. It meant that victims of mob violence found no justice in the courts. It meant that honest businesses lost out to mob-backed competitors. It meant that the public's faith in its own government was systematically broken. On a more intimate scale, the human cost touched Lansky's own family in ways he could never have anticipated. His cherished desire to provide a normal, respectable life for his wife and children was ultimately a catastrophic failure. The wall he tried to build between his criminal life and his domestic life was always a fiction, and it came crashing down with devastating force. His sons, Paul and Buddy, and his daughter, Sandra, were forced to live with the horrifying knowledge of their father's true identity, a burden of notoriety and fear that they carried for their entire lives. His son, Buddy, who suffered from severe cerebral palsy, became a source of profound anxiety for Lansky, who worried endlessly about who would care for his vulnerable child after he was gone. The fortune that was supposed to secure Buddy's future had to be hidden so perfectly that it became inaccessible, a cruel irony that likely caused the father immense private torment. The relentless government pressure and the constant surveillance turned their home into a gilded cage, a place of paranoia and isolation rather than the sanctuary he had intended. The wife he loved, Anna, had to endure the humiliation of the deportation hearings and the public spectacle of her husband being branded a kingpin. The family man who wanted to be a pillar of his community became a symbol of its corruption, and his family was forced to share that shame. Perhaps the most poignant personal cost was Lansky's own isolation. In his final years, the architect of the most powerful criminal consortium in American history, was a lonely, sick old man, abandoned by the associates who had once revered him. Trapped in a small apartment with only his regrets and his failing health for company. The phone no longer rang with calls from powerful men seeking his counsel. The stream of furtive visitors had dried up. He was a pariah, a king without a court, a general whose army had deserted him. The brilliance that had been his greatest asset became his prison, isolating him in a world of his own calculations, a world that had ultimately proven to be hollow. The fortune, the power, the respect, it had all evaporated, leaving behind only the consequences. The addicts still suffered. The corrupted institutions still struggled to regain public trust, and his family still bore the scars of his legacy. Meyer Lansky's story is therefore the ultimate cautionary tale about the true price of power attained through corruption. It demonstrates that no matter how brilliant the mind, no matter how perfect the system, the bill eventually comes due. The cost is not measured in dollars and cents, but in the broken lives and the eroded trust left behind. He sought to build an empire that would make him untouchable, but in the end, he could not escape the most fundamental human realities: loneliness, regret, and the enduring pain inflicted upon those he claimed to love and the society he secretly ruled. The takedown of Meyer Lansky was not just a legal or financial process. It was a moral reckoning that revealed the profound emptiness at the heart of his magnificent, malevolent machine. As the dust of the 20th century settled and the figure of Meyer Lansky receded from immediate memory into the realm of legend, his story underwent a fascinating metamorphosis, transforming from a contemporary criminal narrative into a timeless archetype, a cultural and historical reference point that continues to be analyzed, debated, and recontextualized. The man who so desperately craved anonymity in life has achieved a strange, posthumous celebrity, his name evolving into a shorthand for a specific kind of power, the power of the unseen accountant, the master manipulator who operates from the shadows. This evolution of his legacy is a complex process, shaped by popular culture, historical revisionism, and the changing nature of crime itself. In the decades following his death, Lansky began to appear as a character in films and television shows, but rarely as the central protagonist. He was often the quiet, well-dressed man in the background, the one who spoke in a measured tone, while the more volatile gangsters ranted and raved. Films like The Godfather Part, with its character of Hyman Roth, loosely based on Lansky, cemented this image in the public consciousness, the aging, cerebral, and ultimately treacherous partner who believed were bigger than U.S. Steel. While these portrayals captured his calm demeanor and his business-like approach, they often simplified the profound psychological complexity and the vast, systematic nature of his real-world empire. He became a trope, the brains behind the brawn, which, while accurate on the surface, failed to convey the sheer scale of his innovation. For a new generation of writers, historians, and journalists, Lansky became a subject of intense fascination precisely because his story resisted easy categorization. He was not a folk hero like some Depression-era bank robbers, nor was he a purely monstrous figure like a serial killer. He was something more unsettling, a bureaucratic genius who happened to be a criminal. Academic papers began to analyze his business strategies, comparing his corporate structuring of the syndicate to the rise of modern multinational corporations. His life became a case study in the sociology of power, exploring how ethnic minorities in America sometimes turn to illicit means to achieve the wealth and influence denied to them by the mainstream. His Jewish identity became a particular focus of analysis, with scholars debating whether he was a defender of his people or a source of profound shame. A man who used his ill-gotten gains to support Jewish causes while his methods fueled anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jewish greed and cunning. This ongoing historical analysis ensures that his legacy is never static. It is constantly being re-evaluated through new lenses. In the world of law enforcement and intelligence, Lansky's ghost remains a foundational lesson. The FBI and international agencies study his methods as the prototype for modern financial crime and organized criminal networks. The techniques he pioneered, shell companies, layered financial transactions, the use of offshore havens, are now the standard operating procedure for drug cartels, terrorist financiers, cybercriminals, and corrupt oligarchs. Every time an investigator traces a complex money trail that leads to an anonymous shell company in the British Virgin Islands, they are walking a path that Lansky helped to blaze. His legacy is the reason why financial intelligence units exist, why anti-money laundering regulations are a global priority, and why a simple cash deposit of over $10,000 triggers a government report. He is the negative inspiration for an entire architecture of financial surveillance, the most significant evolution in the Lansky legend, however, is his relevance to the digital age. In the 21st century, his philosophies have found their ultimate expression. The dark web, with its encrypted marketplaces and anonymous cryptocurrencies, is the spiritual successor to his hidden counting rooms and numbered Swiss accounts. A modern cybercriminal selling stolen data or ransomware is employing the same principle of deniable plausibility that Lansky mastered. They are a username, a wallet address, a ghost in the machine, just as he was a silent partner in a seemingly legitimate corporation. The rise of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, with their potential for anonymity and cross-border fluidity, is a technological realization of his dream of a perfectly untraceable financial system. He would have undoubtedly been a master of this new landscape, using mixing services and privacy, coins to launder money with an efficiency he could only have imagined in his own time. Furthermore, the corporate model he imposed on organized crime is now the model for the most sophisticated cybercriminal gangs, which are structured like tech startups with CEOs, department heads for coding and marketing, and customer service representatives. Lansky's core insight that crime is a business that benefits from corporate structure, strategic planning, and financial sophistication is more relevant today than ever before. His story, therefore, is not a relic. It is a living, evolving warning. Meyer Lansky demonstrated that the greatest threat to a society is not the street-level thug, but the sophisticated intellectual who can weaponize the financial and technological systems that society depends upon. He proved that crime is not a static phenomenon, but an adaptive one, constantly evolving to exploit new vulnerabilities. The ongoing takedown of his commission is, in reality, a perpetual war, a race between the innovation of criminals and the adaptation of the state. The ghost of Meyer Lansky does not haunt the past. He inhabits the present, a spectral reminder in every complex financial crime, every sophisticated cyber attack, and every shadowy online marketplace that the battle he began is far from over, and that the blueprint for building a hidden empire is still in circulation, waiting for the next quiet, brilliant mind to pick it up and begin drawing plans anew. And so we arrive at the final, sobering conclusion of the saga of Meyer Lansky, a story that stretches from the pogroms of Imperial Russia to the digital frontiers of the 21st century, a narrative that refuses to offer easy morals or neat resolutions. The tale of the mob's accountant is, in its ultimate essence, a profound and unsettling meditation on the American dream itself, on the dark, twisted paths that can be taken in its pursuit, and on the hollow echo that often awaits at the summit of a mountain built on sand. Lansky achieved the immigrant's fantasy. He arrived with nothing, a small, quiet boy from a world of fear. And through sheer force of intellect and will, he carved out a kingdom for himself. He amassed power that presidents envied, wealth that tycoons coveted, and influence that shaped the course of nations. He proved that a man could, indeed, defy the system, outsmart the authorities, and create his own rules. But the victory was a mirage. The empire was built on a foundation of corruption and violence that ultimately corrupted the builder. The fortune was so perfectly hidden that it became a myth, useless to the man who created it in his final, needy years. The power he wielded so deftly for decades evaporated, leaving him isolated and hunted. The family he sought to protect was ultimately scarred by the very legacy he built to secure their future. The great tragedy of Meyer Lansky is not that he failed, but that he succeeded so spectacularly on his own terms, only to discover that those terms were meaningless. His life stands as an eternal question mark against the simplistic narrative of success. He had all the ingredients of a great American titan: brilliance, ambition, innovation, and relentless drive. He was a financial genius, a logistical mastermind, a peerless strategist. In a different life, with a different moral compass, he could have been a Rockefeller, a Carnegie, a Jobs. But he chose the shadow over the light, and in doing so, he demonstrated that success without integrity is its own form of damnation. He is the dark doppelganger of every rags to riches story, a chilling reminder that the journey to the top is meaningless if the summit offers only a view of the abyss. The mystery of his missing millions is the perfect symbol for this emptiness. It is a treasure hunt with no treasure, a puzzle whose solution only leads to another, deeper puzzle. The money, the physical proof of his triumph, has become a phantom, a testament to the transitory nature of all worldly gains. It doesn't matter if it sits in a Swiss vault, if it was lost to legal fees, or if it was secretly donated to charity. Its ultimate fate is irrelevant. What matters is that it was not there for him when he truly needed it, not for comfort, not for peace, not for redemption. It was a score he kept in a game that, in the end, had no winner. His story is also a permanent warning about the nature of power. Lansky believed that true power was invisible, that it resided in the quiet calculation, the secret deal, the hidden ledger. And for a long time, he was right. But his downfall proved a more ancient truth, that no power, no matter how cleverly concealed, can forever escape the light. The state, with its vast, impersonal, and relentless machinery, will eventually grind down even the most brilliant individual. His life is a lesson in the futility of believing one can build a permanent empire outside the bounds of law and morality. The walls will always close in. The ghost will always be dragged into the light. The final call to action for us, the audience reflecting on this epic tale, is not to marvel at his criminal genius, but to learn from his profound human failure. We are left not with a desire to emulate his methods, but with a reinforced commitment to the values he so casually discarded: integrity, transparency, and the understanding that true success is measured not by the wealth one accumulates or the power one wields, but by the positive impact one has on the world and the love and respect one earns from family and community. The story of Meyer Lansky is a masterclass in what to avoid, a map of a road that leads, inevitably, to a dead end. If you have found this deep dive into the hidden history of the 20th century compelling, if you are fascinated by the complex interplay of crime, power, and the human psyche, then we invite you to become a part of our community. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell, because we are dedicated to unearthing more of these forgotten stories, to pulling back the curtain on the secret forces that have shaped our world. We have more tales to tell, more mysteries to unravel, more lessons from the shadows to bring into the light. The takedown of the commission was a pivotal moment in American history, but it was just one chapter in the endless struggle between order and chaos. Help us explore the next one. Your engagement fuels this journey into the heart of the hidden past. Thank you for listening.